What's cracking, guys? Your boy Daniel here from Stack Strength, and today I'm going to show you guys how to eat more while getting lean. Um, I know a lot of people talk shit and say that you can eat whatever you want when you're dieting, and that's just not true. But there are absolutely some really effective strategies that you can implement to make your diet a lot more successful, a lot more enjoyable, and probably most importantly, a lot less miserable. Because ultimately, if you are dieting for a long period of time, if you're trying to get very lean, that can be a very difficult process. So we want to make sure that we can remove as many points of friction as possible. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. How can we remove those points of friction, allow you to eat more high quality foods, feel better, feel less hungry, have less cravings, while simultaneously seeing better results with your body composition and your fat loss. So let's dive right into it. Now, first, we're going to do a little bit of an overview on weight loss and some of the main obstacles to weight loss. So when we're talking about some of these obstacles, these are things like an increase in hunger. So obviously when you're dieting and you're restricting calories, you're going to see an increase in hunger once you get down to a certain level of calorie restriction and or body fat percentage. You're going to see potentially training performance impairment, especially once you start getting down really low. You might have lower energy, potentially worse mood or lower mood in general. And then there's also a lot of lifestyle variables that can potentially come in and impact your adherence. So these are going to be things like your immediate social circle. What does your current social life look like? Do you live alone or do you have roommates? Do you have a spouse? Do you have children? Do you go to a lot of work events? Are you traveling a lot? What kind of access to food do you have? A whole host of different things that are going to affect your weight loss. However, we're going to address some of the main ones just regarding eating and exercise in this video, because the rest of those are a little bit more complex and do require a little bit more of a nuanced discussion. Now, when it comes to losing weight and manipulating your body weight in general, that all boils down to something called energy balance. So energy balance is the relationship between energy intake and energy expenditure. So how many calories are you consuming versus how many calories are you burning through exercise and just your total daily energy expenditure, your BMR, all of the kind of different metabolic processes that go on a regular basis. So that's basically what's going to manipulate your body weight. Now, it's really important to understand that just because you're manipulating your body weight doesn't necessarily mean you're improving your body composition. You can lose weight and lose a disproportionate amount of lean mass while not necessarily biasing loss of fat mass. So it's very important to understand that whenever it is you're trying to lose body fat, you want to make sure you're incorporating some sort of resistance training into your program. This is so incredibly important because that is going to preserve muscle mass very well. And if you do it correctly, your resistance training frequently at a sufficient amount of intensity, volume, and all of that stuff, and you're dieting intelligently, you can preserve the vast majority of muscle mass during a diet phase. So it's very important, and that is assumed for the rest of this video that you are already resistance training and you're doing so intelligently. So the two primary tactics that we're going to use in this video are, first, a high energy flux approach, and the second is going to be improving the food quality and composition that you're consuming. So for starters, what is high energy flux? So high energy flux basically is similar to the energy balance equation. The only difference, or the main difference, is that energy balance can happen on a spectrum. So if I consume very little calories, but I'm also not active at all, I can be at energy maintenance, which means that I'm not going to gain weight or lose weight. If I'm extremely active, I can also eat a lot more calories and still be at energy maintenance. So there's a spectrum in terms of the energy balance and where you sit on that spectrum. Energy flux determines where you sit on that spectrum. Am I at a low energy flux or a high energy flux? And that's what we're basically going to be utilizing. By increasing the amount of calories that you consume, we can also increase the activity, make you feel more satiated, and it has a whole host of additional benefits that we're going to cover in this video. Now, one thing that the research shows pretty clearly is that across the board, adopting a high energy flux approach appears to be very successful in successful weight loss and weight maintenance. Now, these are obviously averages, and it's not necessarily going to work for everyone 100% of the time. However, it is a very effective approach. I've used it a ton for myself, as well as for athletes that I've used who are trying to get a little bit leaner. So it's highly effective, and it has a high degree of efficacy, and a lot of people also back this anecdotally. Now, It can also help improve adherence and reduce hunger cravings because there's a lot of different benefits to it. So some of the pros of adopting a high energy flex approach. One is you get to eat more food. This is an obvious benefit because you're going to feel less hungry. Exercise also helps regulate hunger signaling. Exercise tends to slow gastric emptying, so you feel a little bit more satiated for longer. It also helps, like I said, regulate some of the hunger hormones and hunger signaling in general, so you're not always getting these cravings, or at least it's reduced um, comparatively to if you were, maybe had a low level of activity. Less hunger typically is going to mean less cravings. Typically, if you're eating a lot more, or if you're able to eat more calories, your performance is going to be preserved for longer during your cutting phase. It's also going to potentially slow down the metabolic adaptations that are going to occur, or at least it's going to make sure they happen a little bit later on in the diet. So it's going to make the process a little bit easier for you. And like I said, there's a whole lot of benefits we just covered. Now, some of the cons of adopting a high energy flex approach. Standardizing energy expenditure via a step count, or basically any way, can be a little bit difficult at times. So if you're not using the exact same method to standardize energy expenditure, there is going to be a higher degree of inaccuracy, and you may not necessarily be doing it correctly. So you might be shooting yourself in the foot. However, that's if you're doing it wrong. If you do it correctly, it can be very, very beneficial. So that's just kind of a caveat to put out there. If you standardize energy expenditure via a step count, that's going to be pretty damn consistent versus using a step count one day, then cycling the next day, then biking, then like longboarding or hiking or whatever. We want to make sure that we're standardizing whatever energy expenditure we're using. So using a step count can be very effective. However, it can take a lot of time. So if you're going to, let's say, take 10,000 steps per day, that can take a good 2 hours to do. So it's 2 additional hours out of your day that it might require. So that is a consideration. Higher increase in resources in terms of time and effort, okay? Next, if overdone, it actually may increase hunger signaling. So if you go too far to that end of the spectrum in terms of too much exercise, that can definitely start to increase hunger signaling, and that can definitely sabotage your process. If you're going too much, that can increase fatigue, and also it can be a little bit more of a psychological burden. Like I said, if you're constantly pushing, you're just going to feel really beat up and worn down all the time. So we want to make sure that although you are going to increase energy expenditure, that there obviously is a point of diminishing returns, and you don't necessarily want to exceed that. Now, where's that point going to be for each individual? That might potentially change. However, we do have some very, very good general guidelines that can be fairly accurately adapted to most circumstances. Now, when we're looking at practical application of implementing a high energy flex approach, the number one way to affect this is through NEAT. So NEAT is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Basically, that is just sitting, talking, moving, all of these things that are primarily innate. You don't really think about it, and you can't necessarily consciously manipulate this. Even if you really try, it's still going to be regulated by mechanisms that are somewhat beyond your control, okay? Now, one of the components of NEAT is something called NEPA, which is non-exercise physical activity. So this could be something, like I said, a step count. Now, a step count is very, very effective, again, because it is standardized. It's not the same as, if you go running, you don't necessarily know if you're running at the same pace. If you're cycling or whatever, there's a whole lot of variables that can create some inconsistency. Whereas if you're just walking, unless you're really dramatically changing the pace that you're walking, it's going to be pretty damn accurate for the most part. So you're going to have to be pretty dumb to fuck this up, okay? Now, you want to make sure you choose an appropriate approach that doesn't significantly increase fatigue. Now, again, when we look at different approaches, I prefer the step count. That's a huge bias that I have. If we compare that to, let's say, climbing stairs or doing hill sprints or something like that, we can tell that hill sprints and stairs are going to generate a whole lot more fatigue. So again, it does reach a point of diminishing returns, and that can impact in a negative way your actual training performance. So we want to make sure that although we're increasing energy expenditure, it's not going to backfire and negatively impact the core fundamentals that we're really, really trying to promote in the actual intervention that we're implementing. A daily step count. So again, walking on a treadmill is not necessarily the same as walking on flat ground. We also want to make sure that we're kind of standardizing. So if you're walking up hills one day and then you're just walking on flat ground the next day, that is going to have a little bit of impact. Now, that's really not something that I would be overly concerned about. I would mostly just look at, total step count. However, if you are finding that there's fluctuations in your energy and like how you feel and your level of fatigue, you might just be stepping for too long. You might need a little bit more of a runway for progression, but it also might be the terrain. Again, doing 10,000 steps just on flat ground is not the same as doing 10,000 steps going up a mountain or hiking a trail or something like that. So it's also something to keep in mind in order to standardize the actual energy expenditure. Now, like I said, a step count is fairly low fatigue. It's a fairly low fatigue activity, which makes it great. And it also does a really good job at standardizing energy expenditure. Now, in terms of targets, I generally recommend somewhere between 8 to 10,000 steps per day. However, if you're only stepping for, let's say, 1,000 or 2,000 steps per day, you don't need to make a jump from wherever you are right now all the way up to 8 or 10,000. You can kind of create a runway for progression. So maybe take a couple of weeks to build into it. And that's perfectly fine. And you're not really going to miss out on anything because the entire way through, you're still increasing energy expenditure beyond what you were currently experiencing. So it's one thing that's really important to understand as well. Now, one of the reasons why I land on about 8 to 10,000 is when you look at the literature, we can see pretty clearly that there's tons of health benefits of step count, of adopting a step count of around 8 to 10,000. But it seems to sort of peter off at around 10,000. Like with most things, you're going to see that there always is a point of diminishing returns. And that point of diminishing returns for a step count appears to be around the 10,000 mark. So that's generally why I recommend that. It's also probably about the baseline that you need for just good general cardiovascular health. So even if you're a power lifter, people say, oh, you don't need good conditioning or anything like that. You absolutely do need a good aerobic base to be a power lifter. Now, good, again, is a relative term, but if you're hitting the 8 to 10,000 steps per day, that's going to cover your base. It's going to make sure you're healthy, and it's going to standardize your energy expenditure to a very good degree. So now we can talk about some food composition basics. Now, by optimizing your food composition, you can significantly increase satiety and bolster adherence. So again, one of the big barriers to successful weight loss and getting leaner and improving your body composition is going to be adherence. Adherence is the primary bottleneck to results regardless of whatever your goals are. Okay, so we need to make sure we can optimize adherence. Now, biasing foods that are low in calories per unit of volume is very important. And you can look at something called the satiety index for some fantastic recommendations. All you have to do, Google satiety index, you're going to come up with a big list, and it's going to have kind of a ranking of how satiating these foods are per unit of volume. Okay, so these are things like lean proteins, fruits, vegetables, and other foods that are high in fiber. So again, some examples of this might be chicken breast, a variety of different fruits and colored vegetables. We're looking at things like potatoes. Potatoes actually have one of the highest rankings in terms of satiety, and they have a very, very high food volume as well. So you can eat a ton of them, and they're quite low calorie. So you're getting really good quality carbohydrates, lots of nutrient-dense foods, and you're also making sure that you're actually having a high food volume. So you're going to probably feel a little bit more full than you would be if you were just eating highly processed, calorically dense foods. Now, when we're looking at things like sauces and seasonings and spices, there's also plenty of things that are low calorie, especially if you live in the US or in Canada. There are plenty of different options. You can look at low calorie rice cakes. There's 0 calorie sauces. There's plenty of like different types of, what are they, like calorie free jellos or calorie free drinks and different things like that that you can switch to. You can switch to Diet Pepsi or Diet Coke if you're drinking a full sugar Coke. You can have low calorie juices. So there's a variety of different things that you can do in terms of drinks, sauces, spices, seasonings, all that stuff that are low calorie options that are going to be available at your local supermarkets. So those are things that I would definitely check out. And you can even just Google them too to get a quick rundown of what potential options are out there for what potential low calorie options are out there in your area. Now, one last thing to talk about is the food palatability reward hypothesis. What this says basically, or what the researchers have found, is that if you are dieting, it can actually be pretty beneficial to make sure that you're not eating highly calorically dense foods, really, really palatable foods. The reason for that is because when you eat these really highly palatable foods, it can actually increase your hedonic drive to consume more highly palatable foods. Now, obviously, it's going to be a hindrance if you are trying to stick to your diet. So in my experience, sticking to whole foods, sticking to good quality foods And yes, making your food taste delicious, making your food be enjoyable, but not going overboard, or else it can actually increase cravings. And that's going to be, variant depending on the individual. Some people are more sensitive to it than others. I know for me personally, if I start eating a lot of really, really rich, flavorful foods, that definitely makes me crave more foods. So it is something that I'm a bit more cautious about, and I try and stay away from it when I am dieting. Now, a couple additional considerations to leave you with um, are potentially deciding to go out less when you're dieting, right? So if you're someone who goes out eating out, let's say every Wednesday for wing nights or something like that with your friends, create a plan beforehand. So if you are going to go out, I'm not saying you shouldn't. This is entirely up to you. It's entirely based on the balance and the trade-offs that you're willing to make based on your goals and lifestyle and things like that. However, some things that could make it a little bit easier for you are limiting how often you're going out. If you're going out 4 or 5 times a week, you might want to cut that down to make it a little bit easier for you. Or if you are going to go out, you might want to make sure you're planning ahead, either looking at what other options are available that are potentially a little bit lower calories so you can stick to your diet, or maybe even just eating right before you go out so you're not necessarily as hungry and you can reduce your total caloric load. Um, Another important variable is constructing your home food environment. So if you have a bunch of snacks at home, if you eat with your family and your kids, and there's all this other stuff there, you're a lot more likely to actually eat those foods versus if they weren't in the house, or if it was just a little bit more difficult to gain access to it. Again, we want to make sure that we're reducing points of friction that prevent good behaviors from happening, and we want to increase the amount of friction or points of friction that prevent us or stand in the way of us enacting those unproductive behaviors that don't necessarily support your goals. So these are just some practical tips that are going to help you do that. Another thing is making sure that you're keeping busy. A lot of the research that looks into eating at night or boredom eating and all of these things actually talk quite heavily about a lack of fulfillment and not actually being busy enough, not having things to do. And so you reach for food as a coping mechanism, something to kind of make you feel a little bit better about the anxiety of not having anything to do, or just being boring, or not having, a whole lot of fulfillment. Now it sounds a little bit harsh, but that's actually kind of true. So you want to make sure that you are actually staying busy, you are actually keeping yourself occupied, you're getting some hobbies, you're going out with friends, you're doing more fun shit. Now, how hard is that to do? Get better on your diet by going out and doing more fun shit. That sounds like a pretty awesome win-win to me. So give it a shot. The next thing is seek support from your social circle. This can be really important. Like I said, if you have kids, if you have a spouse, if you have a group of friends you're constantly going out with, you guys are really close, food is a really important experience. It's a really important social experience that helps bond people. That's why for Christmas, for Thanksgiving, for all these different holidays, you come together with your friends and family and you share food, you break bread. It's a really, really important social dynamic. So if you actually go up to these people and you tell them, hey, you know what, I'm dieting right now, I'm trying to eat well, I want to make sure that I can get your support, you understand what my goals are and why they're important to me, can I ask for your help? And 9 times out of 10, they're going to say yes. In fact, I would say it's almost 10 times out of 10, actually, because I've yet to hear anyone say, no, I'm not going to help you, right? But it's really important sometimes, if you have people in the midst who are potentially influencing you in a negative way, just have that conversation with them and say, hey, you know what, this is a really important goal. And like I said, they're going to be supportive if they really care about you. If you do a good job sitting down with them and saying, hey, you know what, I would just really appreciate your help, they're going to support you. They're going to have your back. And that can also make the process a whole lot easier versus if you don't have that conversation and then they're just always wanting you to drink and, go and eat out with them. They're not going to be pressuring you as much if they know that your goals are really important to you and they already agree to support you and stand behind you. So hopefully that makes sense, guys. I hope that you can use some of these tactics immediately in order to actually see better results, eat more, and get leaner all at the same time. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you on the next video.